Welcome again to Learning with us here at Drisha. This class is the philosophy of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks with Rabbi Alex Israel. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Israel.
Okay, great. Wonderful to see you all. Hope people can hear me loud and clear. And I actually see a a chat already somebody put up who said that they wish that Rabbi Sacks had been at the King Charles coronation because there was a genuine friendship. There really was. I know from Dan Sacker, who used to run Rabbi Sacks, used to be Rabbi Sacks's media person, that when Rabbi Sacks, in the last month of his life, was in a hospital, one day Prince Charles's office phoned him up and said, Prince Charles has an important speech and he needs some help from the rabbi. He needs the rabbi to help him to help him to help him with the speech and with the concepts. And Dan said, listen, he's sick. And Prince Charles, apparently his assistant said, he needs help. So he actually went through the archives and gave a few paragraphs, and apparently that was enough. But it's very interesting. Also in the autobiography of Prince Harry, he said that after one particular scandal where Prince Harry had worn a Nazi uniform to a fancy dress party, to a Halloween party or something, his father wanted him to understand how seriously it had hurt people, and he sent him to go to speak to Rabbi Sacks. And Rabbi Sacks went to talk to him about the concept of tshuva, and that we are not caught by our past, and that we can always change. And he writes about this in his autobiography, Spare. So yes, there was a special relationship between them. All right, let's get to our topic for today, which is not Prince Charles. And we're going to Prince Charles, King Charles, whatever. I'm actually happen to be going to England tomorrow, and I haven't been there for ages. So it's always funny being somebody has lived in Israel 32 years and you go back to England and everything is, on the one hand, so familiar, and on the other hand, everything is so unfamiliar. I think any of you who've moved from country to country probably know that feeling. So it's, it'll be interesting. Okay, we're going to today study ostensibly the book known as Morality, which was Rabbi Sacks's final book that he personally published, and he worked very hard on morality. Interestingly enough, his office told me that there were many, many books which he wrote, and he wrote it almost, gave them a draft and gave them a final version, and it was the draft. He said morality, he had one version and then a second and a third. He did something like 7 or 8 versions, and he was going to launch it just before Corona hit, and then along came coronavirus. And he had launched it already in the UK, and he didn't manage to launch it in the US. And then he decided to launch it anyway with all sorts of Zoom podcasts and interviews. And for that reason, we actually have quite a lot of footage of him talking about the book Morality and the ideas within it. And you can look for various different podcasts. There's a Tim Ferriss podcast. There's all sorts of interesting interviews on YouTube where he was interviewed because it was COVID and he couldn't travel out of the country. He had planned to be, at the time I was working for Machon Pardes, and I remember I asked him if I could interview him during that September for something in Pardes online on Zoom, and he said no, he's totally booked up with Zoom calls promoting morality. So that's the book we're going to discuss today. However, I'm going to slip in a different book as well. And that is a book called The Politics of Hope, which he wrote in 1997. And in fact, that book, both books talk about where is society going, in particularly where is a multicultural society is going. Where is a society which is a secular society? How is it going to retain its values? Now, the argument of both books is predominantly the same. However, in Morality, he spent a lot more time talking about contemporary problems. Obviously, 1997 was pretty much even before the internet really took off, and certainly before we had smartphones. So the world has changed considerably. Before people spoke about safe space, I guess people spoke about political correctness, but not safe space and all. But we'll be flipping back between both of the different books. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to share the screen and we're going to begin. Oh, great. So actually, oops, wrong share. As I put a link in the beginning, that always reminds me that I'm meant to be sharing a video, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to share a video to begin with. And let me say something about this video, which is a video I really, really love. This video comes from an interview that Rabbi Sacks did with an organization known as The Tortoise. It's called The Tortoise because they say we think slowly. It's meant to be a place where news isn't too fast, news is slow. And he was invited to the newsroom of The Tortoise, and he's asked by the anchorman or the chairman or the editor of the newspaper. He's asked about what he thinks about the question of who is a sage, and he gets talking about what are the problems of the age. So that's where we're going with this, and you'll hear him talking the question and the answer, and we'll listen for a few minutes, and you'll hear Rabbi Sacks expressing. Okay, here we go. By the way, it's called The Tortoise, and they actually have a tortoise which walks along the top of the room for an hour, and then it ends. So that's. But this was a lovely, lovely interview. Let's go.
Before I turn to you, Rabbi, I actually was going to just reflect on the conversation we were having just before we came in here, because the question I was asking Lord Sacks was, well, who today are the moral leaders? Who are the people from whom we get, if you like, our day-to-day morality? And I just wanted to start by asking the room, if you were thinking, is it my friends? Is it my teachers? Is it my politicians? Is it somehow the figures in public like this? No sniggering, please. Just going to put them in as well. Is it public figures? Who are the people who you think are if you like, the sort of holders of the flame of modern morality, or certainly your morality today? If I was to ask you, for example, do you think your friends? Who would say your friends are probably your best guide to sort of moral judgments that you make? Smattering of friends. Who here thinks it is teachers? Thinks that teachers are the people probably you look for? One extremely well-taught, 1.5 well-taught people over here. Who thinks that it is actually public figures? I'm not saying necessarily politicians, but public figures with a public following. We were talking about whether it's David Attenborough or J.K. Rowling or the Prince of Wales. Who thinks public figures are the sort of moral holders of the flame? Who here thinks, just out of interest, it's politicians? Generous of me to ask. Who here thinks that it is religious leaders? Who thinks it still is religious leaders? I say I'm really struggling here because we're about at least 2/3 of the way through my list. Sorry? Parents and family?
Yes.
Parents and family. All right, well, why don't I go to you on this, Lord Sacks, given that we've got... This, I suppose, is at the heart of the book, this sense that we're very unclear where our morality comes from. And if you can, actually, I'd love you just to set out the sort of the core argument that we've outsourced morality to the market and the state.
James, thank you. I think the show of hands is very interesting because until we mentioned parents and family, we were really searching. And I remember, for instance, maybe 20 years ago, going around and asking everyone I knew for a period of some weeks, who is a sage? And almost everyone I asked replied Isaiah Berlin. And then I said, okay, who's number 2? And nobody could give me a number 2. So it was clear that we had a problem with sagacity. And I suspect that's why you created Tortoise, because we're all running so fast. We're not stopping to see the view, or as Matthew Arnold said, to see it steadily and see it whole. So we are short of sages, and that's what makes someone like James and Matt D'Ancona to found something like this. I think we're short of moral role models, with the exception of parents, where in that case, in my case, exactly the same. My late parents were my moral role models, very much so. Why are we short of this? My argument in the book is because we thought we could outsource morality. We thought we could outsource lots of stuff. We thought we could outsource production to China, to Southeast Asia, and we could. Trouble is, we didn't think what impact it would have on people here. We thought we could outsource memory to Wikipedia. I mean, why need to remember anything when you can look it up in a microsecond on your phone? The only trouble is there's a difference between history and memory. History is an answer to what happened. Memory is an answer to who am I? And those are very different things. And you can't delegate identity to a computer. You can delegate facts, but not identity. So, likewise, people felt you could outsource morality to 2 institutions, the market and the state. Because morality is a matter of 2 things, the choices we make and the consequences of those choices. The choices we make are represented by the market, and that fitted a certain view of morality, which is whatever works for you, so long as it's legal and you can afford it. So the market became our metaphor for moral choices. And our responsibility for the consequences of bad choices, we delegated away, we outsourced to the state. What happens when marriages fail? What happens when education fails and so on? We delegated to the state. And we said, you could run a free society on the basis of economics and politics alone. The trouble is you can't. You can't for one simple reason. Politics and economics are arenas of competition. One is a competition for wealth, the other is a competition for power. You need something else in a society other than competition. The classic moment. Did you see The Imitation Game about Alan Turing with, you remember Benedict Cumberbatch looking lugubrious and Keira Knightley says, tell them a joke. And he tells them a joke. You remember, 2 explorers in the jungle, they hear a lion roaring. One of them starts looking for a place where the 2 of them can hide and escape. The other one puts his running shoes on. The first one says to the second one, what are you doing? Running shoes. You can't run faster than the lion. And the second one says, I don't need to run faster than the lion. I just need to run faster than you. Now, this summarizes Charles Darwin's dilemma. Darwin understood that every society that he knew of valued altruism. But if you look at the joke story, it is the altruist who gets killed by the lion. And it's the person who puts his own survival who survives. So Darwin actually said that anyone who took risks.
Okay, I don't want to spend the whole class on the video, so I think we better get started. I hope that was sort of clear. Rabbi Sacks is basically saying, first of all, we have a problem with sagacity. We have a problem. We don't have role models. If anything, our role models are our parents, our family. We'll come back to that much later in the class today. And that we've outsourced. We've just thought that we could let the markets regulate our moral choices. We thought we could let politics regulate our moral choices. But these have become arenas of competition. And says Rabbi Sacks, we need something else. We need something beyond that, beyond the competition. By the way, I feel that to a certain degree here in Israel today, when we're having a big discussion, national discussion, except we're doing it Israeli style, so it's a national argument about how we want our future to be. And the problem is that government is a bad way of doing it. When people get away from legislation, they can all have conversations where they can agree. It's when it gets to government that everybody gets stuck, because it's all about power, and it's about not sharing power, and this is the problem. So Rabbi Sacks' basic argument in morality is that we cannot just rely on the markets, we cannot just rely on politics. There's got to be something else which is giving us our content for society. So let's take a look in his own words. Well, you already heard his own words, and it's a pleasure to hear him. But he basically says like this: all countries and cultures have three basic institutions. There's the economy, which is about the creation and distribution of wealth. There's the state, which is about the legitimization and distribution of power. And there's the moral system, which is the voice of society within the self, the we within the I, the common good, right? And he loves that phrase, the common good, that limits and directs our pursuit. And maybe that's really important, our pursuit of private gain. It's the voice that says no to individual me for the sake of the collective us. Some call it conscience. Freud called it the superego. Others speak of it as custom and tradition, yet others call it natural law. Many people in the West spoke of it as the will and word of God. Whatever its source, morality is what allows us to get on with one another without endless recourse to economics or politics. There are times when we seek to get other people to do something we want or need them to do. We can pay them to do it, that's economics. We can force them to do it, that's politics. Or we can persuade them to do it because they and we are part of the same framework of virtues, values, and rules and responsibility, codes and customs, conventions and constraints. That is morality. Morality is what broadens our perspective beyond the self and its desires. It places us in the midst of collective order. Morality is always about the first person plural, about we. Society, said Lord Jonathan, means a community of ideas. Without shared ideas on politics, morals, and ethics, no society can exist. Society is constituted by shared morality. So, and if you look on the next paragraph, he also says, it creates trust, right? Oops, that was a mistake. It creates trust, right? When we have trust and we belong to the same moral community, we can work together without constantly being on guard against violence, betrayal, exploitation, or deception. The stronger the bonds of community, the more powerful the force of trust, and the more we can achieve together. Now, I don't need to tell any of you on this call, on this class, that this has started fragmenting, okay? This is fragmented big time in American society, in British society, pro-Brexit, against Brexit. I love the framing that somebody once gave, and I've forgotten, sorry, just forgotten his name, who spoke about somewheres and anywheres. He said there are people in society who could be anywhere. Just take your laptop, go find a Bet Cafe, go find a coffee, a coffee shop, and I can work for my venture capital company. I can give my Zoom classes and all that sort of stuff. And then there are some people who have to be somewhere because they need to turn up for work, right? They're service providers. They work in a factory. They work in the fields. They can't be anywhere else. And by the way, that is the division in many ways between red states and blue states in the United States. That was the division between Brexit, of the pro and the anti. Some people said, I'm a citizen of the world. I'm an anywhere person. And other people said, no, I belong in the countryside of Great Britain. And therefore, all those immigrants are polluting our environment. And that is, I see Lauren's comment, Mrs. Thatcher assumed that there was no community, no common ground. And actually, Rabbi Sacks has written about the fact that he disagreed with her. Anyway, what we have here is a society which no longer shares values. Once you could talk about Britain as a broadly Christian society. By the way, I think this latest argument here in Israel about the legal reform has unraveled the social fabric of Israeli society. Some people saying, well, if you're going to do that, then I'm not sure I want to play my role in the army, right? And other people saying, well, and in other words, we can't agree on common ground. If we all share values, that's great, right? But we can't rely on the market because that puts us against each other. We can't rely against politics because that's an era. Where's the glue that holds us together? Where are the common values, right? And that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in the age that we're living in. And it's exacerbated by individualism. It's exacerbated by the privatization of morality. It's exacerbated by our cell phones and our social media bubbles. That's what we have here. So, I'll just read a little bit more with Rabbi Sacks, and then we'll start dealing with. So he says, let me just read the end of this because I love the way he says. He says, starting in the 1960s, that changed. First came the liberal revolution. It is not the task of the law to enforce shared morality. Morality gave way to autonomy with the sole proviso that we did not harm others. That was the 60s. Then in the 80s came the economic revolution. States should minimally interfere with the markets. Then in the 90s and gathering pace ever since came the technological revolution, the internet, tablets, smartphone, and their impact on the global economy and the way we communicate with one another. Social media in particular has changed the nature of interpersonal encounter. So let me add, I'll carry on reading in a second, but let me add that sometimes we have more in common than people who are in other continents than our neighbors. And he says, each of these developments has tended to place not society, but the self at the heart of moral life. It's not that people became immoral or amoral. That's patently not so. We care about others. We volunteer. We give to charity. We have compassion. We have a moral sense. But our moral vocabulary switched to a host of new concepts and new ideas. Autonomy, authenticity, individualism, self-actualization, self-expression, self-esteem. And he says, but now our children and grandchildren are paying the price of abandoning a shared moral code, divided societies, dysfunctional politics, high rates of drug abuse and suicide, increasingly unequal economies, a loss of respect and truth for truth and the protocols of reasoning together, and the many other incivilities of contemporary life. What morality is outsourced to either the market or state, society has no substance, only systems, and systems are not enough. The market and state are about wealth and power, and they're hugely beneficial to the wealthy and the powerful, but not always to the poor and the powerless. The rich and strong will use their power to exploit the rest, financially, politically, etc., etc. Okay, that's enough for now. So this is quite a challenge, I have to say. And Rabbi Sacks talks about how morality, he called it, in the same way he called it almost like climate change, right? Like we're experiencing climate change and we're seeing the environment change, but it's too big. It's bigger than we are, right? So he said that we are experiencing moral climate change. The environment around us is changing. This is changing our own lives. Now I feel hot or cold, or there's a hurricane, or there's a flood, and everything's gone to extremes. And this is deeply, deeply problematic. So how does Rabbi Sacks deal with it? If you look on the last page of your handout, page 8, you'll see the table of contents of the book. And let's just take a look there. It's on your screen now. He talks about, he's got his introduction, cultural climate change, and then he goes through a whole bunch of, sorry, I don't want to depress you too much, but hopefully he'll come up with some solutions, right? Loneliness, the limits of self-help, on social media, the fragile family. I think you can guess what all of these chapters are about. Consequences, from we to I. That shouldn't say T, that should say I. Sorry, I scanned it in wrong. Markets without morals. He talks about the gap between directors' pay and the lowest worker. Consuming happiness, that everything's become, you go and have, what's it called, retail therapy. You think we can buy happiness, but we can't. Democracy in danger, identity politics, time and consequences, and post-truth, safe space, right? And the return of public shaming, the death of civility, victimhood, okay? So these are, and then he gets into the end, part 4 and part 5, what it means to be human, how do you create human dignity, meaning, morality matters from I to we, how do we get it back? So this is where Rabbi Sacks, has really charted out where our generation is, and I think it's pretty powerful. I'm going to go through 3 issues that he discusses in the book because we just don't have enough time to do everything. And the first one is self-help. He says, suddenly we've got this notion of self-help and self, the I, right? I've got to just read the first couple of the lines, right? He says, I admit, a long-time devotee of self-help books. I've felt the fear and done it anyway. I've refrained from spreading the small stuff. I've experienced the life-changing magic of tidying. I know the power of now. I'm okay and you're okay. I no longer I guess, worry who moved my cheese. And I've read more books on happiness than I can count, shelf loads of them. And my commitment stretches way back to the classics of the genre. I've even read the first one, Samuel Smile's Self-Help from 1859, with its no-nonsense opening, Heaven helps those who help themselves. And he says that, one second. If I look back at my life, I discover it was always someone else who set me on a new trajectory. I suspect that is true for most people, right? Very simply, he says, right, it's not about me. He says, someone who was there when we needed it, who listened when we put out our problems, who gave us an encouraging world when we were about to give up. He says, what help I have found time and time again comes not from the self, but from others. So that's the first lesson he says. This idea of isolating ourselves and thinking we can read a book which will help us. And this is, he says, is a real problem. And he illustrates this. I mean, Rabbi Sacks, as well as being a philosopher, is, of course, Rabbi Sacks. So he illustrates this with a Gemara, beautiful Talmudic passage. Rabbi Chia bar Abba fell in, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. He says, Chavivin alecha yisurin. Are you happy with your suffering? Your suffering's welcome to you. And of course, right, Rabbi Chia says, not them nor their reward. And he said to him, give me your hand. He gave him his hand and he raised him. So the guy's in bed, he's miserable, he's depressed, or he's sick. And he says, do you like your sufferings? He says, no. So he says, give me a hand, and he helps him up. That was Rabbi Yochanan's hand. But now Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. And now Rabbi Chanina, a different scholar, went to visit him, and he said exactly the same thing. Chavivin alecha yisurin, do you like your suffering? Right? And he said, no, neither them nor their reward. He said to him, give me your hand. And he gave him his hand, and he raised him. And the answer the Gemara says is, why could Rabbi Yochanan not raise himself? Obviously his hand was able to raise Rabbi Chia. Why can't he raise himself? And the answer, ein chavush matir atzmo mibeit ha'asurim. A person, the prisoner, cannot free himself from jail. In other words, we always need someone else. It's never enough just to have ourselves. We always need somebody else to sort of be there for us. And that is the lesson he learns. Well, I'll just, he goes back to Kohelet, right? If you look on your sheet, Kohelet, and he says, gives this lovely story. He talks about Kohelet. Let's go to the second paragraph. We recognize Kohelet. He's the billionaire with a private jet, the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the holiday home in Cap Ferrat. I had to, by the way, look that up. I didn't know where that was. The Armani suits, the expensive wife who discovers that it all adds up to less than the sum of the parts. The route to happiness turns out to be harder than taking the waiting out of wanting. Kohelet forgot something that I discovered by chance. Someone had written to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in a deep state of depression. The letter went something like this. I'd like the Rebbe's help. I wake up every day sad and apprehensive. I can't concentrate. I find it hard to pray. I keep the commandments, but I find no spiritual satisfaction. I go to synagogue. I feel alone. I begin to wonder what life is about. I need help. And the Rebbe wrote a reply, and the reply didn't use a single word. All he did was this. He circled the first word of every sentence and sent the letter back. The disciple understood the Rebbe had answered his question. The ringed word was I. In other words, I'll skip to the bottom because I don't have a lot of time. Happiness lives in the realm called not I. So this is the first thing that I wanted to share, this idea that happiness is in the space called not I. And this is what Rabbi Sacks was trying to teach us, that we need to live in a community, the idea of being isolated. And I have to say, thank God, Judaism does this very well. The Bet Knesset is not a Beit Tfilah, it's a Bet Knesset, a place of gathering, right? If it's a place of gathering, maybe the Kiddush is as important, as important as the prayer service. And, you know, that's where COVID really took a deep toll on us. But what Rabbi Sacks will argue is that we have to build and actually foster our connections with other people to make sure we have to build community. One of the books that Rabbi Sacks used to love quoting was called Bowling Alone, and that Americans used to bowl in clubs, and now people are going bowling, but they're bowling alone. And he says, just this is awful, because we all need other people to set us right, to give us support, to be there for us. So the idea of this isolated, this transition from the we to the I is quite devastating. Let's go to the second one, which is this sense of identity politics. And I'm going to share another video, which is a video that he did for actually a Christian group who had this relationship with Rabbi Sacks. And these are like young Christian scholars who are on a fellowship. And they got a chance to ask Rabbi Sacks a bunch of questions about his book Morality. And just by the way, this was filmed in September 20, just before, pretty much 2 months before Rabbi Sacks died. If you saw the previous video, which was from January that year, you'll see how well he looks. If you look at this video, you can actually see how sick he looks. And it's amazing that nobody told him to go to the doctor because he got to the doctor too late. But you'll see he just really doesn't look well here. Anyway, here we go. I hope this is the right one. Yeah, this is it.
I'd like to turn to Matthew Garces.
My name is Matthew Garces, originally from Georgia, but currently live in Washington, D.C. A question I have for you is, as an individual, I possess many identities. I'm a Christian, a Latino, a man, just to name a few. Is there a right way to involve identity in politics without descending into the dangers of identity politics?
We all have identities. Hopefully not too many of us have identity politics, because identity politics is a way of saying my particular identity is all that matters. And of course, Matthew rightly says, for none of us is that true. We've got multiple identities. Mm-hmm. I'm Jewish, I'm English, I'm British, I'm European, I'm Western, and I have many other things as well. So I think we're all multiple identities, and identity politics, number one, radically simplifies that to a point which is really dehumanizing, because we're all bigger than one box. Secondly, it is closely identified with the concept of victimhood. I suffer because I am X. And victimhood is a really, really bad thing, because, I mean, there are victims and we have to help victims and we must be compassionate and caring about them. But for me to define myself as a victim is really quite dangerous, because if I define myself as a victim, I am saying that someone else other than me is responsible for my fate. In other words, I am handing over sovereignty over my life to somebody else. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to hand over my sovereignty to anyone else. And therefore, and I learned this from Holocaust survivors. All those years that I was chief rabbi, I became very, very close to our British Holocaust survivors. And the extraordinary thing is they were all victims, but none of them defined themselves as victims. They said, no, we're going to take responsibility for our life. And I found that moral courage of a high order, and I could never, ever go down that road of victimhood again. Victimhood, in other words, is a no-through road. It's a blind alley. Once you've put yourself there, there's really no way out. And thirdly, you know, what then becomes of identity? And the short answer is, I will invoke the identity I choose when I think it adds something to the conversation. So, for instance, I'm a rabbi, I'm a religious leader, but you will know from the book that that was, as it were, my second career. My first career was as a professional philosopher. So, you know, I thought to myself, you know, that in the year 2000, there was there was a big gathering of 2,000 religious leaders at the United Nations, modestly entitled the Millennium Peace Summit. Put 2,000 religious leaders together, you do not get peace. But, and you know, you're sitting there thinking, who am I? You know, I'm one in 2,000. And then I thought, hang on, no. Not every religious leader is a philosopher. And not every philosopher is a religious leader. So that combination of identities helped me say something that was really different from almost everyone else. So I think I can speak in the public domain, for instance, as a Jew. If I feel there's something very universal about the Jewish experience, that the Jewish experience gives particular expression to. And then I can drop that into the conversation, and people will say to me, thank you for sharing that with us. And I think that applies to any kind of identity. There will be times when one or other of our identities allows us to contribute something to the conversation that nobody else can. And that is how you do identity without identity politics.
That's good.
Okay, I think that's actually a beautiful, beautiful. Think about what he just did. He said that, you know, don't use identity as a victim. Don't use it as something which pigeonholes you. You're many things, right? You might be African American, but you also have a degree and you also have this opportunity. And then take your uniqueness and use it to contribute. Don't use it to blame. Don't use it to create victimhood, right? So this is another classic example where Rabbi Sacks is saying, you know, use what you have in order to give, and use each identity as it's useful for the environment around you. This is like, you know, classic Rabbi Sacks. So we've dealt with a little bit self-help, identity politics. Let's go on to one other thing, which is on your sheet, which is the idea of safe spaces. The idea that we have these bubbles where we need to, as you've probably heard about on different campuses, to have safe space. And he quotes, again, I'm taking Rabbi Sacks, the rabbi, rather than Rabbi Sacks, the philosopher, but it, you know, it's all one identity for him. And he has this lovely, we have this idea of the greatest chavruta of all time, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And Rabbi Reish Lakish died. And it says here, Rabbi Yochanan was pained over losing him. And the rabbi said, who will go to calm Rabbi Yochanan's mind and comfort him over the loss of his chavruta? And they said, let Rabbi Eliezer ben Padat go, as his statements are sharp. He's sharp and he'll be able to work for as a chavruta. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Padat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan with regard to every matter that Rabbi Yochanan would say. Eliezer ben Padat said, yeah. There's something exactly like that which supports your opinion. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, are you comparable to Reish Lakish? With Reish Lakish, I would state a matter and he would raise 24 difficulties against me. And I would answer him with 24 answers, and halacha would become broadened. And yet you say to me, there's a brighter that supports your opinion. Did I not know what I said was good? In other words, as the commentary here says, being rebutted by Reish Lakish served a purpose. To bring proof to my statements doesn't. And Rabbi Yochanan went around tearing his clothing and saying, where are you, Reish Lakish? Where are you, Ben Lakish? And Rabbi Yochanan screamed until his mind was taken from him. He literally went mad. And the rabbis prayed and requested for God to have mercy on him and take his soul. And Rabbi Yochanan died. Again, what does Rabbi Sacks say here? Rabbi Sacks is saying, we don't need safe spaces. We need brave spaces. We need spaces in which we can have situations in which people challenge us, where we challenge other people, right? And all of these things, again, are what creates community. These are the sort of messages how Rabbi Sacks is giving answers to things like safe space, identity politics, and self-help. And of course, there's a whole book to read, but I just decided to take things from 3 chapters in the book. So the question is, what does Rabbi Sacks offer? What is he going to offer? And I'd like to give a couple of different images which he has. And the first image he's going to have, he actually wrote a book, which is sitting under my laptop right now, called The Home We Build Together, where he actually compared 3 models of society. He compared society to actually 3 models, really interesting. He says the first one is called the country house. The country house is somebody emigrates to Britain and they go and they're put up in a country house. But to be in the country house, you have to have the British norms and you have to speak with a British accent. You have to do British things. So you have to conform. That's maybe how Britain was, I don't know, Victorian era. He says the other option is a hotel. Hotel, right? I can do whatever I like in my room. I paid good money as long as I don't damage it. But, you know, I have nothing in common with the other people around me, right? And then there's the idea of a home. In a home, right, there are rules of the home, but everybody can sort of like, you know, everybody has things they do together, but then also everybody leads their own lives. Can we build a home together? In other words, what Rabbi Sacks is looking is to balance a multicultural society with private spaces and collective spaces. And one of the things that he loved talking about was the notion of park. Take a look here. Not far from where we live in Northwest London is Regent's Park. And most of times of the day, it's full of people relaxing, talking, drinking coffee, reading the papers, jogging, walking, exercising the dog, meeting friends, or just enjoying the sight of other people enjoying themselves. The point about it is that it's public space. It's somewhere where we can all go on equal terms. It's surrounded by private homes, places where I and most of the people who love the park know we could never afford to live, however much we'd like to, but that regret is tempered by the fact there's something far more magnificent. The park itself is ours. In it, we're all equal citizens because we enjoy it and we want it to be there, we keep the rules, usually without having to be told. We keep radios quiet, dogs on a lead. We put our litter in the baskets, return a passing stranger's smile, and otherwise respect people's privacy. That's part of what it makes it a gracious place. For me, the park is a metaphor for a concept I've been inching towards without yet spelling it out, namely society. Society needs virtues, much as our enjoyment of the park depends on its users respecting it and other people who use it. When these habits break down, we need not just law, but collective resolve, many people deciding together to save something that they love. And this, by the way, Rabbi Sacks calls in other places a covenant. You can have laws, and laws are imposed by government, and I have to obey the law or else. But there's something called a covenant where we all agree about some sort of rules. Now, one of the problems in our society is nobody can agree on anything, right? What to one person is automatic, to the other person is oppression. I just love it how in the current debate in Israel, both sides are screaming democracy, but nobody can agree on what does democracy mean. Is it a system of government and freedom, or on the other hand, is it human rights? A simple word like democracy, you can't even agree what it means, and everybody's screaming and yelling the same word with completely different meanings, and that's sort of what's happened. So Rabbi Sacks goes back and says we've got to rebuild this, and the place to rebuild this in so many ways is the family. This brings us back to our first conversation. Who do you respect? Parents and family, right? And he wants to use this as a model. Take a look at this passage. The family. Consider a family, father, mother, and children. They live, eat, and relax together. Though each wants times and spaces where they can be alone, there are certain rules which bind them together, without which they find it difficult to get along. Let us suppose these include things such as that at least on some nights of the week they eat together, that not everyone talks at once, that there's a roughly equitable share of responsibilities for cutting the grass, doing the dishes, feeding the cat, and making the beds, and that when mum and dad say it's time to go to bed, there are rituals of protest followed by reluctant obedience. Sometimes the rules break down, as they do in every family. There are arguments, scenes, minor rebellions. They're followed by routines of reconciliation. Someone says sorry, or he or she is forgiven, order is restored, and love reaffirmed. In this sequence of everyday transactions, we witness in miniature the making and sustaining of the moral life. The family is made up of individuals, but it exists because each is willing to place limits on the pursuit of his or her own desires. Deeply beneath the surface of the family are actually certain fundamental concepts: fidelity, loyalty, responsibility, authority, obedience, justice, compassion. Together they define the relationships of the parents and children to one another. They frame a series of expectations that neither husband nor wife will commit adultery, that when the children are young, they'll do what they're told, sometimes without fully understanding why. That parental requests will be consistent, fair, and in the long-term interest of the child. And the members of the family will not walk out on one another or ignore a cry for help. Except in extreme situations, these things do not need to be spelled out, because the family is a social institution. It's not something its members have invented any more than they've made the language they speak. It's something they have inherited from the culture, from habit of custom, or from the example of their parents, or possibly religious teaching. I'll go to the next paragraph. The family is often thought of as belonging to the sphere of private life, but it's easy to see how it is the birthplace of social virtues. It teaches us the space we seek to create for ourselves is dependent on our being able to rely. We come back to this notion of trust on other people with whom we have established relationships of predictability and mutuality. So that's also something important. And he says we can create families, communities, even societies around the ideals of love and fellowship and trust. Okay? So this is really where he's going with this. And the last theme that I put here on the sheet, I think, hold on a minute, let me just check. Yes, is the notion of covenant, which is such an important idea, right? Let's just read what's highlighted here. He says, one of the key differences between a society based on contract and one built around the idea of covenant is what holds it together. A social contract is maintained by external force, the monopoly within the state of the justified use of coercive power. A covenant by contract is maintained by internalized sense of identity, kinship, loyalty, obligation, responsibility, and reciprocity. And he says here, so there are two stories about human associations, one told in politics class, the other in our religious texts, right? Clearly, they're not mutually exclusive. Civil society requires the institution of politics for the resolution of conflicts and maintenance of peace and defense. Political society, according to most theorists, needs the undergirding of civil virtue. So civil society needs politics. But political society, he says, needs the undergirding of civil virtue. Or put it differently, as he says, one is a Greek idea and one is a Jewish idea. And Judaism has this idea of a covenant, which is related in faithfulness or trust, right? And maybe I'll read the last thing, morality, page 64. The Hebrew word emunah, often translated simply as faith, really means the faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty, steadfastness, not walking away when the going gets tough, trusting the other and honoring the other's trust enough. The prophets understood the relationship between humanity and God in terms of the relationship between bride and groom, wife and husband. Love becomes the basis not only of morality, but also theology. Faith is like marriage. This is what Hosea meant when he said in the name of God, Ve'eras tichli leolam, ve'eras tichli besedek of mishpat of chesed of rachamim, ve'eras tichli be'emunah, ve'edat Hashem. marriage is fundamental to society because throughout history, it has been the most fundamental way in which we recognize something beyond the I of self-interest, namely the we of the common good, cooperative relationships, shared identity, and collective responsibility. Now, where does that lead us? Now, first of all, now you understand why Rabbi Sacks values so much the idea of covenant, the idea of family, and he sees exactly this. And he says, what we have to do is stop worrying about what the government will do for us. That's also a type of victimhood, right? We have to stop isolating ourselves in our I and in our personal space. And we have to start renewing the clubs, associations, school events. We can't rip them apart with identity politics, right? We've got to collaborate. We've got to work harder on families. We've got to work harder on all sorts of different clubs, associations. And through that, he always felt that I might not be in your family, but if I understand what my family is, I appreciate your family. If I appreciate my religion, then I appreciate your religion and what it does for you. And I think broadly that's true if people can get out of their defensiveness and their victimhood. And if we can ride above politics. Now, I have to be honest, I actually wrote a review of the book Morality when it came out. And I wrote in the review that I loved the book and the analyses were great, but he analyzed the problems so well, he didn't give me a lot of hope for the resolution. He just uses in the last 2 chapters, he says, we can do it. And he points to a couple of other times in history where people have become more individualistic and then they've become more collective. I sometimes wonder whether it would take another Second World War to make everybody sort of stride together. And, what I'm saying is that during wartime, we've just experienced this in Israel, right? Today, the rockets are falling, right? So everybody's being nice to one another and everybody's saying, we're going to share and, oh, you can't do a wedding in Sderot, come to here and there and everywhere. And everybody's offering support and love. And everybody was hating each other just a week ago. Does it take that sort of adversity in order to make us realize our commonality? But what Rabbi Sacks was really dreaming of and what he was advocating for was the return to the we. And even if we did it on a local level, on a small level, I sometimes wonder, I've been reading certain articles about people leaving big cities after COVID and moving to suburbia. And of course, moving to suburbia can sometimes mean you're even more isolated because you've actually got your neighbors are further away from you. But going to suburbia can also sometimes maybe create a sense of togetherness. And that's what Rabbi Sacks was really trying to advocate. He really thought we are only going to begin to get our morality back when we appreciate our we. It doesn't need to be the collective we in a national sense. He says, don't worry about the national, don't worry about the individual, worry about the space in between, communities, religious associations. And that's why frequently religious groups are the best in these regards, because we don't always, love everybody in our community, but when they're in trouble, we stand up for them. And we have that cohesion, right? And, if somebody's chas v'shalom sitting shiva, or there's a funeral, or there's a wedding of a mitzvah, we'll still go up to them and wish them mazel tov, even though they're not our best friend. So that is what community can do. So that's really it. That's the arguments sort of summed up here. Of course, Rabbi Sacks does a far more sophisticated job at going through all the history of the social and political changes, and that's way beyond what I was able to summarize in this small amount of time. But I hope I've given you a taste for the sort of arguments that Rabbi Sacks is using and the methodology that he applied. Next week, we're going to turn our attention to Medina Israel and Rabbi Sacks's attitude, which will actually follow on very nicely from today. Rabbi Sacks's attitude to the state of Israel. And look forward to seeing you all again then.
Okay, should we give a minute for questions, or do we have any questions? Let me check the Facebook to make sure. No, no questions. Okay. Oh, something in the chat. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Rabbi Israel. Thank you for me and all the participants.
להתראות next week.
And
Fabulous.
thank you so much for all the participants also that are a regular part of our learning community here at Drisha. Just a couple announcements. The deadline for our virtual summer Kollel program has been extended to until next Monday. So if you were meaning to apply, here's your chance. You can learn more and submit your application at kollel.drisha.org. There are also a few spots left in each of our girls' summer programs. So if you know any young Talmidot who are interested, encourage them to finish their applications as well. We also, as usual, have many classes happenings. You can look at our website at drisha.org for more of those classes. And I can't wait to see you and learn together again. Lehitraot. Lehitraot.